Okay, so I am starting with this metal piping so you can get used to mixing neutrals and different ways to make neutral colors without using black in your color scheme. So how to mix blacks. I don't really have any very like dark value colors that are dark in value, so I'm not going to get anything as close to black as possible, but I know that you guys have actually darker value colors in your paint sets. So we're going to be mixing chromatic neutrals instead of achromatic. Chromatic neutrals means you're mixing color into your grays, and achromatic is whenever you do not have color in your grays and you're just using black and white. So right now I'm going to show a few different ways to mix these gray values. Up here I used red and green to make this kind of like black color, and I also put some white into that. So first we're going to use some red and green. And you're going to have to really change and play with if you want the color to shift more on the red side of black or on the green side of the black. So you can see I'm getting a dark value in there. And I use a lot more green in that one. In this one, I can use a lot more red. So it's hard to see from the camera, but one shifts closer to a red and one shifts closer to a green. So that is how I'm getting this blackish value. Then again, for this, I just want to add white into it. So I'm taking red and green again, and I'm adding white. And see how it has almost like a pinkish tint to it? That's because I have more red in it. If I want to make it have more of a greenish tint to it, I can add a little bit more green. All right, and so on and so forth. I keep adding white to it and it will get lighter in value. So this is one way of mixing the chromatic neutrals of this grayscale that I'm trying to get in here. In each gray value in this picture has a color that it shifts towards. So you can see there's some kind of like yellow in there and there's a little bit of blue happening. I'm also, let's see what happens if I use some purple. And the reason I'm adding the purple is because magentas seem to mix better with the green values to create deeper and darker blacks. So something to think about. Another way to mix black would be, let me see if I have that brown color that you guys have. Well, I have burnt sienna. Burnt umber works better, but let's see if the burnt sienna works. So you take burnt sienna, which is kind of a brown color, wash your paintbrush off, and you want to mix that with the blue. And again, you're getting a darker neutralized color using that. And that's because burnt sienna is essentially an orange that already has a little bit of blue mixed into it. So you are kind of mixing the complements together whenever you do that too, but you're not lightening up that value with the yellow. All right, so to mix your ratios, I'm gonna take 1 dab of red, 1 dab of green. All right, that way I know now I have 1 part red, 1 part green. Try and keep them similar in how much you take out of the tube. That way you know that your parts are equal. Now I'm gonna mix them together and see if I like that value. I think that it could go a little bit more to the green. So I'm gonna put another half part of green in there. So now I have 1 part red, with 1.5 parts green. That's not enough, so I'm gonna put 1 more half in there. That way I'll have 1 part red, 2 parts green. So this is what I would be writing for my ratio next to this. Ideally, you would be doing this on the palette so you could use the paint longer, because it's gonna dry on my paper while I'm mixing this. All right, so now I'm gonna show you how to get that smooth texture now that I showed you kind of how to mix these like black neutralized values. So I'm just starting off kind of with a wash. And my wash is pretty green right now, but that's okay. And I always start with the darker values and add the light values to it. So right now I don't have the angle or anything right on this tubing, which is fine. I just want you guys to get the idea of how the metal texture works. So I'm gonna mix a light gray. So I might do 2 parts green, 1 part red, and like 3 parts white. So that's how you would do those dabs out of the tube whenever you're thinking about this. Whenever you guys are writing your ratios down. When you add white, you might have to shift the ratio of your colors so it doesn't get too red or too green whenever you're mixing. Because when you add white, it's gonna tint one hue more than the other hue. Because certain colors have stronger tinting power. So I started with my dark values. Now I'm putting my mid values in, my mid-tones, and I will do the light values last because it's easiest to do. And be aware that your colors are gonna dry different. The values are gonna look slightly different. The colors are gonna look slightly different. So it's something to think about. So now I'm gonna mix that like orange light value. So it's a white, a really light value, and it's still neutral gray, but it has a hint of yellow in it to kind of give it that orangey hue to it. And I'm gonna go back in and do that kind of light white bluish part on the top. That's kind of creating the reflection and the glow. So I'm gonna add white, and I'm gonna add a little bit of blue to my colors. When I was doing the dark values and the neutral grays, I was doing more wet on wet, and now I'm letting the paint dry a little bit as I layer the light values onto this. So it's starting to get that glow and that shininess to it. I can keep going into this with lighter values because my light values already started to get a little bit darker. And that's why it's good to start dark and then kind of work your way to light, because then you normally get a more variety in value that way, because normally the paint dries darker than what you think it does, and then you have to add more layers to it. So never use white just straight from the tube. Mix it with a little bit of another color. So I'm gonna mix this with, I'm gonna mix it with a tiny bit of yellow. I mean a tiny bit. Okay, so there you kind of have a reflective pipe. Sorry, hard to see. You could keep working into this, adding wet on wet if you really want there to be a lot of like less marks and more gradation between the paint colors and the paint shifts. I kind of like mark making. I could take clean water, so I got clean water over here, and kind of fade this out a little bit, and then I would have to keep working back and forth between all my colors as I get rid of the mark making in this painting. Okay, now we're gonna learn how to mix greens and how to do the texture of this grass here. So I have two different kinds of greens. So I have kind of a light green and a dark green. I'm going to use this perm green middle because that's what you guys have. So I'm gonna get rid of this light green altogether, just because you guys only have one green to work with. And again, whenever I'm mixing the greens and mixing all my colors and trying to figure out what these colors are, I'm gonna do it the same way. So right now, I'm gonna try and get like that mid value of green. And I'm gonna do 1 part green, and I'm gonna do 1 part yellow. And you can also mix your own green using blue and yellow. So that is also an option. 1 part green, 1 part, I'm using permanent lemon yellow. I'm pretty sure, and that for the mid-tone green, I'm not sure if that'll be too much yellow or not. It might lighten that green a little too much. Yeah, so that green is way too light for that mid value green. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna add another part green, because that's darker in value. And then I'm also gonna add a little bit of red to it. So I'm gonna let's do 1 part red. So right now I have 2 parts green, 1 part yellow, and 1 part red. And what I'm doing is I'm taking that red because it's neutralizing the green color that I need. All right, and that gave me kind of a dark green. So I can use that for my dark green, and we'll start with that, and then we'll do a mid-tone green. So I know for my dark green, I'm gonna write it next to this. I have 2 parts green, 1 part yellow, and 1 part red. And I'm just going to kind of paint out a little patch of dark green over here for my little patch of grass that we're gonna do. All right, and then let's do a light green. So I'm gonna do, I'm gonna do 1 part green, 1 part red, and then this time I'm going to do 2 parts yellow, because I know that yellow is lighter in value than the other 2 colors. So we'll see what that looks like. I'm going to wash my brush off, use a cloth wipe it down. And then I'm gonna mix these all together. So that was way too much red. I do not want all that red in there. So I'm going to restart. Okay, again, I'm gonna do 1 part green this time, 2 parts yellow, and let me get a different brush. There we go. And I don't know if I still think I want a tiny bit of red, so I'm gonna do a tiny dab of red, but not 1 full part, like just the tiniest. Like look how tiny that is. You can barely see it on my paper right now. And I'm not even gonna use that whole thing. I'm just gonna dip my paintbrush in that, kind of get it off a little bit. That way there's just a little tiny bit of that sitting on my paintbrush. And now I'm mixing it together. So 1 part green, 2 parts yellow. And that's still a little too saturated, so I'm actually gonna take that whole dab of red and mix it in there. Do another teeny tiny dab of red. 1 part green, 2 parts yellow, 1 dab of red. Not 1 dab, sorry. Well, a little tiny dab of red. And I still think that's a little too light, so I'm gonna put just a little bit more red in there. I might not have cleaned my paintbrush off good enough for that one, so it might have had extra red in it. There we go. It's getting a little bit more neutral. So now whenever I'm doing my grass blades, I already have that dark value in there, so now I can kind of start shifting some of this like mid-tone value in there. It's still not completely saturated, it's a little bit more neutralized, and it's not as dark as that dark green. And you guys, it's hard for you to see, but there is a slight difference. The values almost look the same, but there is a difference in color. All right, now I'm gonna do 3 parts yellow. 1, 2, 3. 1 part green. Tiny dab of red. I'm just kind of putting my red over in the corner there because I don't think I want to use that whole thing. And I'm gonna mix them all together. Because I think my mid value is too close to my dark value, so I kind of want to get it a little bit brighter, but still more neutralized. There we go. I'm gonna use a tiny bit more red in there. And I'm just layering these values on top of each other. That's gonna give you that texture of the grass feel. And I'm starting with the dark values, and then I'm working my way into the light values. And I see that there's more dark values on the bottom, so I'm gonna leave more dark values on the bottom of the grass, and I'm gonna push the light values up closer to the top of the grass. All right, let's get a little bit lighter in value. So 1, 2, 3, let's do 4 parts yellow, 1 part green, or like half, let's do half part green. See what that looks like. I'm gonna clean my brushes. Try and clean them better than what I'm doing, because my water is pretty dirty. I would have refilled this water by now. And I'm not using any white to this because white's gonna desaturate that color. And I kind of want it to be a little bit more saturated. I'm putting a tiny, tiny, tiny bit of red in there. Okay. Now I'm taking my brush, my little brush, And again, I'm just kind of already following along those little strands of grass that I already did, that I already created. And I'm keeping it up on the top of the edges of the grass because I know that is where most of the light's hitting. And the shadows are all on the bottom, which is where these dark values are. Okay, and now I want to do even more. So I'm going to do even 2 parts yellow, a tiny bit of dab of green. So you can adjust your ratios. Like if I don't want to mix as much paint, I just have to like adjust my ratios. Instead of having 4 parts green or yellow and 1 full part of green, I might just do 2 parts yellow and a tiny dab of green. And that's just, it's using the same ratio of paint, but it's adjusting it into a smaller pile. So I still use too much green in that. And this one I don't want any red in because I want it to be really saturated where the ends of light are. I still think that might have even been still too much yellow, or sorry, green. So I'm gonna I don't want to use all my yellow here, so I have some mixed over here. I'm gonna steal some. I'm just taking the green now in my paintbrush and mixing that. I don't really have any tiny paintbrushes to like create these thin little lines of this grass for gouache paint. But so I got some thick brush strokes. You would want them to be a little thinner. But that is how you make the texture of grass. Start dark to light. As it gets darker, you have more neutral values. Whenever the light's hitting it, it turned a little bit brighter. So you add less and less red and less green, more yellow because yellow is lighter in value. And that should give you kind of a grassy texture. And there are light values down here too, so you can, just do it really fast. Create some small brush strokes of like where the light hits in the shadow here. But I wouldn't go too overboard with it. You do want some large areas of dark in that grass pattern. And that gives you that nice like grassy texture. So now I'm gonna be using reds. And now that you guys understand kind of like how to mix parts, I'm just gonna kind of be mixing on my palette from now on. So now you know how to mix and document how much your ratios of paint you're mixing, which color ratios you're mixing. All right, so this is almost like an orangey red. So I'm taking red and yellow to mix orange because I don't have orange. I don't know if you guys have multiple yellows or not. I have one that is closer to an orange, which is permanent yellow deep, so I will use that instead. And again, you want to wash your paintbrush off good. I did not, so now I have like that green in there tainting it, which is why I had to put 2 more dabs down. Clean my paintbrush off, and now I can kind of mix that red in there. And I made that way too orange, so I'm gonna take more red. Oh, darker red. To tone that down a bit. So to get the darks on this red rose, I'm gonna take the darker, cooler red that I have, and I'm gonna mix purple into it. If you don't have purple, mix blue into it. And if I want to neutralize it, I can actually mix a little bit of green in it. But the rose colors aren't that neutralized. They're just more kind of darker, and they're just a little darker in value. That's why I'm mixing purple into it instead of its complement green. And let me get, there we go. So it's almost, mostly purple. Or again, you can use blue. A cool blue, don't use a warm blue. So that's only gonna get me so dark. Once you start getting into like the really dark areas that kind of turn into black, that's when you might want to mix a little bit of green into it, because it will get a little bit more neutral in those areas. So again, I'm gonna map out kind of the structure of a rose, and I'm just kind of making it up right now. I'm not following the exact picture to save time, or else I'll spend a lot of time doing it. So I've kind of been making these up a little bit as I've been going. And I'm kind of painting these, like this mid value in first, because most of the rose is the light and the mid value. And now I'm going to, I added a little bit of blue into my red and purple to darken that value a little bit more without taking it too neutral. So I added blue, not green. And now I'm gonna kind of push those like darker values into this a little bit. And again, you guys should have an easier time, because the paint set that I have really has no dark paint in it to create really beautiful blacks. Whereas I'm pretty sure the one that you have has like really nice dark, so you have some dark colors that you can actually use. So again, I started with my mid values, and I'm starting to add the mid values that are a little bit more neutral. Now I'm adding my brighter, more saturated light values into it, and I'm still not using any white. You can use white in paint, but in certain times you might have to use white to get certain colors. But if you still if you're using a color that's has a lot of color to it still, and it is more saturated, the more white you use, the less saturated it's gonna become. All right, so I got my mid-tone and my more saturated warm orange red color, and now I am gonna push some really dark darks in there. I still don't know the best way to mix the dark for this. I don't know if I want blue and purple or if I want red and green. Oh, just dropped the cap. Next time I do this, I'm not gonna do it at nighttime, because everything around me is so dark and I can't see like anything. All right. Again, this is where you'd benefit from having a small paintbrush that I do not have. Like this just gets really thick whenever I press it down. I still want more purple in that. And red. I forgot to add the red to my blue and my purple. So, generic rose shape, all right, getting that texture. Again, I probably would have laid out these darks a little bit ahead of time, and then the mid-tones, and then the bright colors, and then I'd go back in probably with the mid-tones and darks again. So it is a lot of layering. This isn't the best example of a rose, but I think you guys kind of get the point with it. Blues, purples, and pinks. I'm like running out of my purple here. And everything in this image is pretty saturated. Oh, I need to keep using my really dirty water. So again, I'm just kind of doing a generic water droplet for you. Generic water texture. There's these like rippling of this dark purplish blue color. I'm gonna add a little bit of red to that to just darken it a little bit more. There we go. So I do want you guys to look at the pictures and try to get the pictures as close together as possible, but I also don't want to make this a 2-hour long video. All right, so I got some ripples of that dark purple in there. Now I'm going to mix a light blue. I have 2 different blues, so I have a dark blue that's cooler and a light blue that's warmer. So I'm gonna take this light blue that is warmer. And I am gonna add white to it. And I'm gonna add a tiny bit of lemon yellow to it, because it's almost like a greenish blue. So adding yellow to the blue is making it more green. Tiny bit, otherwise the whole thing will turn green. And more white. If you paint wet on wet, the colors are going to blend together a little bit more. And if you let them dry out, it's just going to paint over top of it. So see how these colors are kind of like smearing together a little bit? That's because I'm painting wet into wet. I'm not letting the paint dry at all. All right, now I'm going to go back in with more kind of purple. All right, and now I'm gonna mix more white and I'm gonna get that light blue. I would focus on all your blues first before you start adding like the pink color into it. All right, now I'm gonna mix some pink. So I'm taking purple and red, or blue and red if you don't have purple. Mixing them together, adding a bunch of white to it. Probably should have mixed it in a different place. And I'm not going to be able to, I don't have the colors to get that like bright neon pink. I can use a little bit more red in it to make it more saturated, but I just do not have the colors to get that pink. I already know that. It's too red. See what happens. Add a tiny bit. Doesn't really look like it has any yellow in it at all, but sometimes yellow makes pink look a little brighter. No, it's just turning it orange. Yeah, I'm not even gonna put any more pink in there because I just can't make that color with what this paint set gave me. And sometimes, depending on what paint you're using, you might not be able to get a color that is that artificial looking. Artificial means not made in nature. All right, so there's my little kind of texture fast of water. You can't really see my paint drop up here. I should have made it in the, I should have painted the rest of the water around it so you could see it a little bit better. But that is a really fast way to kind of mix these textures. Obviously, you're going to want to make them more detailed than I did, spend more time on it, a lot more layering. Certain things you want to do wet on wet, other things you want to let dry. So this, I would probably let this water dry a little bit more and then do some more line work of those like light, those like almost those yellowish white highlights in the water. That way they don't mix so much into this blue, and that would really give that kind of like glowing reflection happening in this water here. Okay, and I think that gets the point across for how to treat color mixing and how to think about color and mixing ratios. I know I didn't go through all the colors like yellow, and we didn't do purples or anything. So if you have any specific questions about those, we will do them one-on-one together. All right, thanks, bye.